Hello, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University. Thanks for joining another installment of our series, Understanding Our New World. And today we're really privileged to be joined by one of the foremost historians in the United States, Ed Larson. Professor Larson is joining us from Pepperdine University, where he's been at for some time. He actually grew up in Ohio, Mansfield, Ohio, attended Williams College, and then the University of Wisconsin, where he got a doctorate. We're going to talk about that. A law degree from Harvard. He's practiced law in Seattle. He is a prolific author. He's an author or co-author of 14 books and more than 100 articles. And I want to quickly read through a few of the articles because I've always prided myself in having pretty wide-ranging interests. But then I looked at Ed's publication credits. I felt a little bit modest because Ed has written about this. He's written about the constitutional origins of the vice presidency, the red dawn of geoengineering, the constitutionality of lame duck lawmaking, the U.S. presidential election of 1800, exploring Antarctica, the politics of history, the meaning of gene testing for disability rights, the British quest for the South Magnetic Pole, medical rationing, death panels, and the rising cost of healthcare, Darwin and science, and religion versus science, America's perilous fight. And he's also the author of I said 14 books, but two that I have on my bookshelf. The first one that just came out last year is called Franklin and Washington. We will talk about that. And then this came out some years ago, the Summer for the Gods, the Scopes Trial in America's Continuing Debate Over Science and Religion. Ed published this in maybe 97, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1998. So Ed, thank you so much. It's great to see you.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
Well, tell us a little bit about growing up in Mansfield, Ohio. In one of your books, you refer to your dad as kind of a Clarence Darrow-like lawyer. So tell us about your folks and just growing up in Mansfield.
Well, Mansfield is a classic Rust Belt town. When I grew up there, I'm old enough, it was flourishing. It really was. It had about 60,000 people, and it had wonderful factories. I worked in them in the summer. I worked on the assembly lines, personally for Westinghouse. My brother was in the steel mill. We had a half dozen Fortune 1000 companies based there, like Tappan gas ranges. And so it was really a wonderful place. And then NAFTA came, and the factories moved to Mexico. And now it is just, it's lost a lot of population. I remember my dad taking me by the arm and saying, don't ever come back here. There's no future. And it's sad because both my parents are buried there, and I have lots of wonderful memories. It was a wonderful place to grow up. But, you know, Ohio is a bit like a cyclotron. It has so many people of such interesting people who grew up there, and then it spews them out. It runs around and they spew out wherever, whether it's Bob Hope, who grew up there, or Roy Rogers, or Ulysses S. Grant, who of course left for Illinois and settled there before he moved on. You could just go on and on. William Tecumseh Sherman, the liberator of Georgia. His brother was from Mansfield, William, the author of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And one of my classmates is now a senator from Ohio, Sherrod Brown.
In fact, we had an event with him a few months ago, and he was utterly terrific. Well, and I was reading in Wikipedia in your entry a reference to some kind of event you hosted with Martin Luther King at your house. What was that? What was that about?
I didn't host it. The Martin Luther King Jr.'s, the civil rights leader, his uncle, Joel King, was a very prominent African-American minister in Mansfield and was close friends with my dad. My dad became the judge and the common pleas judge, trial court judge. It's a small county. We only had one thing. And Joel King was a big supporter. And so once a year, I dug up a couple newspaper articles about it. Martin Luther King would come up to preach in his uncle's church. and we get to go because of the relationship between my dad and Joel King. Not that we knew really Martin Luther King. And so I would always sit up in the choir. And I was just little, of course. And he preached very differently than our preacher, much more demonstrative. And that's what I remember, sitting behind him and watching his back and watching his arms flail and his tone go around. And it was absolutely mesmerizing. But one of the times after the service, he came back to our house rather than to Joel King's house. And I remember him just coming over. So it's not like we really hosted him. We were just sort of the after service event. And I believe, I'm almost sure the governor, Jim Rhodes, was there. I know he came sometimes. So it was quite an event.
That sounds amazing. Well, another bit of your convergence with popular culture I read was, were you at the game in which Henry Aaron hit his 715th homer? And I read, again, Wikipedia said that you may have caught a batting practice homer. Tell us that story.
In fact, if you look closely, you can actually see it behind me over my shoulder. It's on the counter up there. Yeah, it was I was at the game at the Riverfront Stadium in Cincinnati when he hit the one that tied the record. Remember, he was one short when the season ended. And so you waited the entire winter. And his opening game, he was playing Cincinnati back then, always as the oldest team in the National League, always got to host the first game. And it happened to be with the Braves. It was just scheduled that way. And so the first time he was going to play after this break was there. And the Braves were going to hold him out. But Bowie Kuhn said, you can't do that. And he was a commissioner and ordered him to play in the first game. And I got tickets with a friend. And we chose, instead of sitting anywhere else, we chose in what his dad had some sort of connections. I think he was a lawyer for the team, and got us seats out right in the prime home run area. Turned out on that day he did hit a home run, but it landed below us in where the pitchers warmed up. But during batting practice, he hit 2 home run length balls. And I caught one of them, the second one, I think it was. And so the reporters didn't have anybody interview, so they came to me as the last person to catch a home run length ball, whatever that means, by Henry Aaron before he had tied, before he was the home run champ. And he did sign the ball for me. So wow. I have.
That's great. Well, and let's talk about your intellectual development. You then went from Mansfield to Williams College, and you studied history, I presume, and political science, and you actually studied under a very famous historian, James McGregor Burns. Talk about Burns and his influence on you.
Jim Burns was a wonderful teacher and an incredibly kind man, and he engaged Williams as a small college where the faculty has very close connections with the students. I went there because I wanted to go to New England to school because I was a fan of, Thoreau and Emerson and Hawthorne and all that New England literature. And I just wanted to go someplace a little different than Ohio. I grew up right near a great small college called Kenyon College. And that's where my dad went. And I figured, I want to go to a school like it, and Williams was the closest thing I could find in a different area. But yeah, I ran into James McGregor Burns there, and I was planning to do political science because I was interested in political science. And he was actually on the political science department, but he wrote what was back then sort of dismissively called anecdotal history, political science. That is, they wrote about people and things. They wrote stories. They wrote like historians, and he did. And he had won at least one Pulitzer Prize and one National Book Award. He was the expert back then on Franklin Roosevelt. There are a lot of other people who write on him now. He had served in during the war as one of those historians who goes with the Navy places, and then he picked up Roosevelt after that. And so but the other history of science, and I was planning to major in political science, but the other political scientists were all into mathematical model building. Now, it turned out in grad school, I ended up getting a specialty in quantitative history. But back then, as a young undergrad, I just wasn't interested in quantitative political science. And that, I think it was during my year that I had to pick my major. Maybe it was either my sophomore or junior year. Maybe I had to switch majors. But Jim Burns took me aside and said, he knew what I was struggling with. And he said that year he was president of the American Association of Political Scientists, or whatever the group was, the elite top of the, he was in charge of the Association for Political Science. He says, if I had to do it now, I'd major in history, not political science, because all they do is model building. And that, and I do think now I've learned that model building can tell us a lot. But back then, before big data, we didn't know as much about those models. And I liked the anecdotal stuff, as they called it. I liked the storytelling. I liked describing, sort of like Cairo does for LBJ, those wonderful stories. And they tell me a lot. And so anyway, that persuaded me to hop over to history, even though Jim Burns remained a very close friend, clear to the end. And we got together many times. He was an inspirational person. He ended up developing the field called leadership studies. That's what he's known for. And I've contributed a few things to leadership studies with him. And I still know his wife, who's still alive and actually still teaching at Williams, Susan Dunn. We've worked together on some projects. So yeah, that was a wonderful inspiration. It truly, truly was. You are lucky to have a mentor like that.
And then Ed, when you went to Wisconsin, you were in a PhD program called the History of Science. Is Madison particularly well known for this program? And tell us a little bit about it. I mean, was this, and what was your interest in science, kind of the big ideas of science, or kind of the chemistry set you had at home, or the microscope or telescope? I mean, what was your specific interest in science?
I always loved taking science classes, so I actually liked science. But what I was interested back then, it seems almost of the past now. But remember, I was in college in the 70s, and I was interested in how science had become, and again, it sounds a little quaint now, but how science had gained its cultural authority. Why what scientists said carried criterion of truth, which historically wasn't true. If you go before 1800, scientists did not have particular credibility. Certainly if you go before 1700, they didn't. Religion had credibility or philosophy, but science, by the post-World War II America, I think thanks to the technological spin-offs of science, the effectiveness of vaccines, of public health, of modern medicine, of warfare, atomic weapons and radar and all those things, televisions, radio, science had a credibility back then that I was curious on how, I guess it was an epistemological question of what do we believe is true? Now, it's been interesting. So I went on and wanted to study, I liked intellectual history, cultural history. Ended up, I liked that somewhat better than political history. And Williams did a lot in that field. And history of science is a subset of that. And so it was that sort of questions. And at the time when I asked my professors at asked my professors at Williams where I should go on, and they said the best programs in history, American history, because I was interested in American history, the best programs in American history and the best programs of history of science, the four places to go are, in no particular order, Wisconsin, Indiana, Harvard, and Yale. And it's market is really tight now because you were flooded with the schools had exploded during the 60s, during Vietnam. And so there were all these, young or middle-aged tenured faculty, and there was no openings for new people. And so the market was tough. And they said, if you want to get a job, Wisconsin or Indiana are better, because people, if you graduate with your PhD from Harvard or Yale, there are just not many jobs. They like diversity. They like somebody not from those schools because they're loaded with them. And they also tend to think if you've taught as a TA students at Wisconsin and Indiana, you can teach at our school because your jobs are most likely going to be places like where I went, University of Georgia, University of Iowa, or Southern Illinois University. That's the sort of jobs. And they really don't want a professor. They'd rather have somebody from Wisconsin or Indiana, this is what they said, than Harvard or Yale. And those are the four best. So you might as well go to one of the best if you can. And so that's how I looked at them all. And I loved Bloomington, Indiana, but I also loved Madison. What a wonderful pair. And I don't know, it was a close call, but I ended up going with Wisconsin and loved all my time in Madison. I was from the Midwest, at least in Ohio, we consider Ohio the Midwest. I know when I got to Wisconsin, they view Ohio as East Coast or sort of Mideast. But Ohio's at least in central Ohio, maybe not Cleveland, but in central Ohio, we view ourselves exactly like you would in Southern Illinois. That's how they self-perceive. And so to me, Indiana or Wisconsin look like going home.
Well, Ed, I want to get your books in a second, but I also want to touch on briefly an experience you worked after law school for the House Education Committee and came across a congressman from Southern Illinois by the name of Paul Simon. Tell me about your impressions of then Representative Simon.
Oh, we all thought the world of him. He was, as in a congressman then, but he was so bright and he was interested in so many different areas. And when I was, Education and Labor Committee, those were his, at that time at least, his two prime areas of interest were labor and education, especially, but both K through 12 and higher education. And he was incredibly involved. A lot of our members, all of our members were good, or at least many of them were very good, and they all brought a lot of political sense to the game. But he had a technical knowledge. He liked to get into the weeds and know the details. I remember we had reauthorization of the Math Science Bill, which was the basic funding bill no, that was a new bill. We had a reauthorization of the higher ed bill, and he was very involved in that. And we had a new major piece of legislation where I was there called the Math Science Bill, which was a massive bill. Reagan was president, but the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives, and Carl Perkins from Kentucky was the chairman. And we were doing a major new bill to fund math and science education. And he got very involved in that. He liked to work actually with the staff. He had an excellent staff. He was honestly one of the most engaged at the committee level of almost any members we had. But I was given his wonkiness, I was always amazed how far he kept going. But I do have one story if I have time.
Sure.
We saved him just by chance. We saved him. Well, he wouldn't have fallen into the trap. But if you may use your passive memory and remember during the 2000 campaign for president, Al Gore got in some trouble for claiming he invented the internet. And a couple of us really are to blame for that mistake, I believe. I never asked him about it, but this could only be the source of that claim. And that was, we were doing that math science bill. Well, And we were approached by the legislative liaison for the military, I think for the Army, and they had come up with the internet. They were using it internally. They had devised and designed the military, but they didn't have any authorization from Congress to create the internet. They had done it on their own with extra money, but it had never been authorized, and it should have been authorized. And so they came to us and explained what it was, and we got to use it before anybody else did. I mean, they were using it inside the Army. Mostly, I believe they were using it in the Army research to connect the Army researchers. I'm not clear. Don't quote me on all these details, but I remember the key was it needed to be authorized. And they explained it what it was. We used it. We saw what it was, and we said, this could really be something someday. And to let it public, it had to be authorized. So we talked to the chairman, and we explained it to the chairman. And the chairman, Carl Perkins, was a wonderful, wonderful, very senior, very old member. He died not long after this, but beloved and very generous and very supportive of his junior members. And we explained this thing to him, and he was sitting there, and either one of us suggested, it might have been Jack Jennings, his top aide, or one of us, I'm sure it wasn't me, said, we've got to get this authorized. How do we do it? And so one of them said, either Jack or the congressman, said, well, the only way we can get it authorized, the only bill that's coming out of committee is this math science bill. So we got to tag it on to the math science bill when it's in committee. And we says, well, do you want to do that? And he says, no, this looks big. We want to give it to one of our junior members who needs support. And this could help him to something to bring back. And we had expected that call, and either Jack or I popped up and said, well, the two members that make most sense, who are really, really interested in this sort of stuff, are Paul Simon and Al Gore. Both were members of the House committee. And he said, well, yeah, they'd probably like it, and they could probably figure out what it was. I think most of our members, the chairman said, would never figure out what this internet thing was. They love this sort of techie stuff. And we went back and forth and finally decided, and I don't know who it was, decided to give it to Al Gore first, if he wanted it, because he loved it, and I think he was more vulnerable in Tennessee. So anyway, Al Gore we drafted it up, we explained it to him, he sort of understood it. I think Paul Simon would have done a better job understanding it. But anyway, he offered the amendment in committee to authorize the internet, and that's what he was confused about, that somehow to him authorizing it in the House or something, authorizing the bill, he thought he was in on the creation, and it led to his slip of the tongue. And so we saved Paul Simon by mistake from making the same error, or he would have been remembered as the congressman who claimed to. I don't think he would have made the mistake, but nonetheless, we always thought back when Al Gore made that statement, and I heard it on the radio in 2020. I said, "Oh no, that's our fault."
That is great. That is great.
It was almost Paul Simon.
Okay, who knows what the institute might be on a fundamentally different path had Paul Simon invented the internet. So, well, let's talk about your most recent book, your book on Franklin and Washington. I read it, I loved it, and the thing that's most striking, of course, is it's well written. It's a dual biography, both of these folks. And, we think of our founders sometimes individually and sometimes in various pairings, sort of the obvious one, Washington and Hamilton, Jefferson and Madison, sometimes the rivalries, Jefferson and Hamilton, Jefferson and Adams. But we don't usually think of Washington and Franklin as a pair. And and as you point out, differences in a lot of ways. Franklin was 25, 26 years older. But what compelled you to kind of put the pieces together and do this kind of joint biography of these two?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I totally agree with you. We usually think of really hierarchical relationships. We think of, if we're going to link Washington with somebody, we link him with Hamilton, or we link Jefferson with Madison, right? that sort of hierarchical relationships, or Lincoln and his team of rivals. What fascinated me with this is every historian that I know of ranks Washington and Franklin as the two indispensable players for the Revolution. That anybody else, Jefferson and Adams, Hamilton, however important they were, they could be replaced, but nobody could replace Washington or Franklin because of their unique and respective roles during the Revolution. And actually the same was true of the Constitutional Convention. They both gave credibility to that effort, and they were both crucial. It's not just now, it's back then. Adams said the same thing, Jefferson said the same thing, Hamilton said the same thing. They all said the same thing, that the two indispensable people were Franklin and Washington. So given that, and I was interested in leadership studies. Okay, here were the two indispensable leaders. They must have worked together in some way. They overlapped so much, and much more than I actually knew. I knew they overlapped at the Constitutional Convention, and I knew they overlapped during the Revolution, both at the Second Continental Congress, where they were both the two key players, and then after Washington's promoted to be head of the military and Franklin becomes ambassador to France, they worked together coordinating the providing of French military aid and financial aid. So I knew they worked together, and I was curious, okay, how did these two people who at the time were the most lionized people in America, the most famous Americans in the world, how did they cooperate? How did they work together? Because there are that sort of leadership relationships. There are times where you aren't dealing with a hierarchy, you're dealing with a co-equal pairing, both of whom are essential. Just two examples would be FDR and Churchill. Now, how would the World War II have worked out without both of those people? They had equal dignity. Churchill was actually the senior, older, more world famous person, but Roosevelt, by the time of World War II, had been through the Depression. I mean, they were both independently critical and important, and they worked together famously well. Now, another more modern pairing that you've already raised up with one of these people, how would we have had the Civil Rights Act without both President Johnson and Martin Luther King? They both had their independent source of authority. It's almost impossible to imagine us getting the Civil Rights legislation without both of them. So there are people, and they both, of course, famously had big egos, just as Churchill and Roosevelt did. So how did this sort of relationship work? And so that's what drew me to try to explore and study, since nobody had focused on it, had written about it. I'd already written a book about Jefferson. I've always admired Franklin. I knew their papers and work. So what I did was I just went back and just tried to track, okay, when did they first meet? How did they interrelate? Where did they interrelate? In what ways did they interrelate? And when you look at history from a new angle, even who has more books about what Americans, maybe Lincoln, but Franklin and Washington probably have more books about them than any other Americans. They've been studied and studied and studied, but never particularly from this angle. And that's what I like to do as a historian, take a topic that others have not done, rather than some great, many great historians take a topic that's already been done by somebody else and redo it. And they bring new insights. Great. I like taking a topic that has not been done and try to find things that way. Try to add new insight by taking a topic that isn't done, hasn't been done, and nobody had studied their interrelationship. And I just found it absolutely mesmerizing how these two people work together, because amazingly, they were both so comfortable in their own skin that they had no trouble working together. It's probably because of their personality. Both of them listen more than they talk. Both of them loved to take counsel from other people. Both of them were freely willing to give credit. In fact, Franklin's almost famous for how he always tries to shuffle every accomplishment onto somebody else. It's just the way he was. Washington, too, freely gave credit. So it turned out that despite their differences, cultural differences, they really liked each other and they worked together quite well.
And as you point out in your book, I mean, they inhabited different realms. I mean, Washington was the general and dominated, America in that way. And Franklin was a diplomat, and we sometimes forget, with all the amazing accomplishments, he was a world-class diplomat. In fact, I think you quote Gordon Wood saying, he called him the greatest diplomat that America ever had, Franklin. And also in your account of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, I think you said something like, it may have been the finest achievement in the history of American diplomacy.
Well, it's certainly why you're Americans today. Only Franklin could have pulled off getting the area beyond the Appalachians. Nobody ever fought and won that. That should have stayed British by all accounts, but Franklin just talked them into saying, you'd be better off. France is going to take this. You'd be better off turning this over to America. And he wanted it deeply, as did Washington, because both Washington, one of the many areas they agreed was that both Washington and Franklin believed in America's uniqueness, and they believed what made America different from England was the frontier. They both, just in their heart of hearts, believed in the frontier thesis. Again, Washington, wasn't supposed to be rich. He wasn't supposed to inherit the family plantation. He was the first son of the second wife. He had two people ahead of him in line. They just happened to die. So he thought he had to make his money, and he tried to make it on the frontier. He went to the frontier. He became a surveyor. He started acquiring land on the frontier. Franklin, of course, left Boston for Philadelphia when it was a forming town. Both of them and also invested in the frontier. They both thought the frontier was freedom that made America different. In England, and France, remember before the revolution in France, everybody was trapped wherever they were, whatever their parents were, they were going to become. Franklin, grew up poor as a indentured servant and escaped and became one of the richest men in America. And so they both had this sense that what made America different was the frontier. And therefore, since the East Coast was filling up, they deeply believed that America needed the land where Illinois is, the land west of the Appalachians. And so it was Franklin's absolute commitment to get that. And of course, he could sweet talk anyone. He had so much authority, and he basically quietly stopped working with France on the treaty, which he was ordered to work with France, and instead worked separately with England and negotiated a much better peace than anybody could have gotten, a dumbfoundingly good peace, a treaty, and then sprung it on the French, because the French were hoping to get back the Ohio country, which is what they'd had before the French and Indian War. And so, but then it was a done deal. And, no one else could have pulled it off. And so the result was the Illinois country, Ohio country, all that becomes part of the America. And of course, Washington, is delighted because he has heavily invested in at least the area west of the Appalachians in Ohio. And, so we owe that little coup to Franklin's negotiating. But that's the sort of thing, and that's the sort he was clever, and he knew how to work deals, and he knew how to make connections. So he had one sort of gift. Washington had other gifts. They both respected each other's gifts.
Well, and the one thing, I think for me, maybe the central takeaway of this book was just, and I've read a fair amount about Franklin, but just reminded again about just his endless curiosity, his openness, his optimism. I mean, like one of the most powerful bits in your book. I mean, and this might be one of the 2 or 3 final letters he writes. He's in failing health. He knows he's dying. He says, "It's pleasant to see the world growing better and happier. The one is about to quit it." Just a kind of an almost irrepressible spirit to Franklin.
Actually, both Washington and Franklin had that. They both had a sense that the world was getting better because it got better for them. And that gave them a sense of optimism. They both believed in providence, and that gave them a sense. But one reason I think that Franklin and Washington could get along so well is you mentioned the age difference. And it's true, there was an age difference, but there was always, they had first encountered during the French and Indian War, where Franklin was military leader of Pennsylvania. Colonel was the highest rank you could have in the colonial militias then, and he was the colonel of the Pennsylvania militia, and Washington was the colonel of the Virginia militia, a very young man. He'd gotten it because his brother, like he got everything because his brothers died. His brother had been the colonel and he took over. And so during the French and Indian War, they worked together because back then the center of the French and Indian War initially was fought over the area around what's now Pittsburgh, the area of the Ohio River Valley, and that area was jointly claimed by Pennsylvania and Virginia because of the conflicting original charters by the British government. And so they worked very closely together. They got to know each other during the French and Indian War. But remember, even back then, when Franklin at that time was almost twice the age of Washington, Washington always was much older, seemed much older. He always acted like an old man. It's just the way he was, that dignity. Franklin, in contrast, had always acted like a kid. There's that famous line where he's being introduced to the new delegate from Georgia at either the Constitutional Convention or the Second Continental Congress. Didn't matter. Franklin was the oldest man at both events, and he was being introduced as our most senior member. And the representative from Rhode Island pops up, but he's also our youngest member. And there was a truth to that. So the age difference didn't matter that much. Washington could look up to him, but just because Franklin acted young always, he was, and Washington always acted old. And so they were always viewed in a way as senior statesmen by the time the American Revolution started, even though really Washington wasn't that old. I think he was about the same age as John Adams, and yet he was always viewed as a senior statesman. And Franklin, simply by maturity and age, even though he acted young, was viewed as a very senior statesman because throughout the entire event, he was the oldest member at everything.
And let's talk about Summer for the Gods, the book that brought you a Pulitzer Prize and huge recognition and so forth. Well, first of all, let's just go from that. I mean, I think you won the Pulitzer. You're maybe in your mid-30s. I mean, that must have been a nice little career bump, wasn't it?
It was a total surprise. I didn't even know the book was a contender. But it was a pleasant one. I think partly that was an example also of trying to write about something that hadn't ever been written about. The Scopes trial at the time, I wrote it in the 90s, in the 1990s. The Scopes trial was certainly well known. It was everyone, probably even more famous than it is now. Everyone knew about it. It was an American event, sort of like the Boston Tea Party or the raid at Harper's Ferry. It was an iconic American event, but no historian had ever written a book about it. There had been a play, Inherit the Wind, longest running play at the time, the longest running play in Broadway history. The movie that followed with Spencer Tracy. There had been novelist had written about it. A journalist, Ray Ginger, had written a book about it, but all of them brought their own particular techniques to it. Nobody had brought a historian's eye to it. The journalist had simply taken, Ray Ginger's had simply taken newspaper accounts and strung them together. Well done. It was a well-written book. But nobody had gone and done archival research, the things that historians are trained to do. Nobody had looked at the letters and the papers and tried to rethink this. Also, I had another advantage. So it hadn't been written about. It was a well-known event. So that struck me as popular, as a good reason to do it. I do owe some credit to one of my colleagues at University of Georgia who happened to, in the middle of the O.J. Simpson trial, said to me, I've got a perfect topic for you. You should write about the Scopes trial. I said, why? I immediately realized why. But even before I asked, I was curious to see why he thought why. He says, well, you do history of science and you do law, you have a law degree. And I never saw how they connected, and they connect perfectly in the Scopes trial. But the reason why during the O.J. Simpson trial, they always had these dead times. And so they'd have these analysts trying to fill up the dead time, and they talk about other trials of the century. And inevitably, the Scopes trial, along with, the Leopold Loeb trial or Sacco and Vincenti, would be listed as one of the trials of the century. And so it was getting a new a burst of attention. So it was from that I decided, okay, I knew enough about the trial that no historian had ever written about it. And by this time, all the papers of all the participants, some of the people who watched it were still alive, and I was able to interview them. But including some of the witnesses, the children who were witnesses. But all the papers of all the participants were now available. So I could find all the papers of the many lawyers on both sides. They'd all been donated to the University of Tennessee or the Tennessee Archives or somewhere or other. And so I was able to really repack that thing. And also, one great advantage of when the Inherit the Wind was written in the 1950s, anti-evolutionism was perceived by the cultural elite, by Bob Lee and Jerry Lawrence, who I became very good friends with and who wrote Inherit the Wind. They thought anti-evolutionism was dead. They didn't know it was still alive out in places like where I grew up or where you are. And so they were actually writing Inherit the Wind in the same way that the Crucible was written, as a way to expose the bigotry of McCarthyism. They were upfront about that. And so it had Inherit the Wind totally transforms the trial into a sort of a McCarthyist type thing, which it wasn't. And so, but by 1990s, when I was writing, anti-evolutionism was back alive. There were all the equal time laws and balanced treatment laws, and intelligent design was coming up, but certainly the young earth creationism of the Genesis flood was widespread. And we'd had President Reagan had called for teaching both creationism and evolution in the schools. And therefore, these were alive issues again. And when you're a historian and when you're a reader of history, both, you look at things differently because the arguments resonate in a new way with every generation. And there had been such a sea change from the time anybody else, whether it be a journalist or a playwright, wrote about Inherit the Wind and wrote about the Scopes trial. And by the time I did it, so I could bring that added cultural perspective.
We might even just tell our viewers that since they probably have not thought about this as recently as I have, and the Scopes trial was a 1925 trial in Dayton, Tennessee, in which Tennessee law prohibited the teaching of evolution in public high schools, and a whole series of characters.
Human evolution. Only
That's right.
Human evolution.
Right.
But that's an important difference, because back then people had the religious people who were pushing it had no problem with evolution of anything else, and they didn't have any problem with the earth being very old. They just thought humans had to be created in the image of God.
Great. But you're right. You say the issues raised by the Scopes trial and legend endure precisely because they embody the characteristically American struggle between individual liberty and majoritarian democracy, and cast it in the timeless debate over science and religion.
Yeah. That's the way I viewed it.
Well, let's use that as kind of a segue to kind of bring us to where we are now. And I guess the one thing that is, one thing that just struck me just in the last couple of days, I saw where President Biden, one of his first acts was to put a portrait of Ben Franklin in the Oval Office. And he explicitly said that is his way of conferring respect on science. And it struck me as interesting because in the last few years, I mean, science has become so completely caught up in our political debate. And I just wondered where, I mean, for example, Mr. Biden in his acceptance speech said, you know, this is a vote for science, among other things. So to kind of unpack it, why over, let's say, the last 4 years, has it become fashionable and even politically advantageous to deride science, to ridicule it? What code is going on that makes this a feasible line of attack?
You ask a question that I don't think has a definitive answer to it, because you have to step back and look at these people. You talk about President Biden. When you really think about him, he's the most deeply religious president America has had probably since Jimmy Carter. Maybe George W. Bush. George W. Bush was personally very religious, but not his dad, not President Reagan, not President Clinton. I mean, Biden goes to church all the time and it has profoundly deep religious beliefs that mean so much to him. And yet he's talking about science. On the other hand, you look at President Trump, and he did have, there's no indication that he's a particularly religious man. There's no indication that he doesn't accept evolution. He's never said anything critical of evolution. Now, he did appoint a Secretary of Education who's a creationist, Betsy DeVos. But so you wonder, okay, how did these things get stretched in this way? Now, certainly I think that the revival of the creation evolution controversy that revived really in the 80s with the rise of young earth creationism of the sort of that now associated with someone like Ken Ham, that unlike Brian, unlike the time of the original anti-evolution crusade I wrote about, totally relaxed any sort of science. Brian tried to reconcile his religion with his science, and he thought the earth was very old. He said so at the Scopes trial. He didn't say, I don't know whether it's 8,000 years or 800 million years old. It doesn't matter. He thought all the other species evolved. It was just that humans, at some point, God had inspired a soul into an evolved ape, was basically what he believed. And that's reconcilable with some views of evolution held today, even by the head of the NIH, who's a true scientist. So today that there's a core and religious group, maybe 40% of the American people, who have come to reject any sort of scientific explanation of origins of anything, for a direct, literal interpretation of the biblical account, which none of the early fundamentalists 100 years ago would have. None of them. Not the Schofield Reference Bible, not any source of authority in the fundamentals would have done this. You go to climate change, same way. there has been a concerted effort to draw certain religious elements into the objection to any scientific basis for creation for human-caused climate change, even though that wasn't if you follow it back, originally the religious people, doesn't matter what church, seemed to be at least as concerned about the environment and about climate change. You can just look back in the 1990s when Newt Gingrich has that wonderful ad with Nancy Pelosi say we both agree on climate change. And then you see a conscious effort to use the questions about science that had developed in the anti-evolution area and to draw support by people who want to oppose for economic or whatever reasons the climate change, because the climate change objections arose. You can follow the industry, you can follow some physicists who raised those issues who got concerned about climate change because they didn't want big government controlling everything. Fred Singer would be an example of that. And drawing the religious groups in. So I think it's more tied to a classic American phenomena of anti-intellectualism that Hofstadter wrote about, that, and goes all the way back to Andrew Jackson and before, that if played right, we can create a resistance to intellectuals, to elites, that we have this democratic notion about us. This populism is attractive. And that's why putting Ben Franklin in the Oval Office is especially interesting, because Ben Franklin was both a scientist, in fact, one of the most important scientists of his century for developing the idea that electricity flows. So basically the fluid theory of energy is tied to Ben Franklin's work, one of the most important concepts we have in modern science. But he also had the popular touch. He could reach out and write Poor Richard's Almanac. He could write stories for people. He could draw normal people like you and me into his web and make it all sound attractive and interesting. And therefore, he could bridge the gap between science and popular culture. You have other people who want to, for a variety of economic, political, religious, whatever, I think they're different with different people and different issues, want to other science and makes them a threat and use this anti-intellectualism. So I think there is that play into it, and science. I mean, just look at the Trump administration. They went right to science. They tried to have that fast track this vaccine. That was one of their issues. We're going to develop this vaccine. They poured money into developing a new vaccine, and they succeeded within a year to come up with 2 effective vaccines in their policies. So that is actually turning to science. And at the same time, they tended to downplay the wearing of masks. Now, why? And so you have to, it's sort of a balance, but it's not a total rejection of science, and but it's a selective use of it. And that, I think, is a problem, because obviously we do have to worry about, we are a democracy, and what role should scientists play? Certainly science can unleash all sorts of good and bad things. And science, I love the way Galileo put it. Galileo was asked about, Galileo was the first one to popularize the idea that the Earth goes around the sun. And that created problems with certain readings of the literal reading of passages in the Old Testament, such as you lengthen the day, Joshua lengthened the day by making the sun stand still. Well, that wouldn't work if the Earth went around the sun to create the day. And he basically said about science, science tells us how the heavens go, not how to go to heaven. And now, if you keep that distinction in mind, and if you believe the most important thing in your life is going to heaven, then the balance works. And you'll give science its area and religion its area. But if you want to divide people, you can, and if science makes a suggestion, science can't tell us our morals. It just is not possible. And when it tries to do so, it can run into problems. So there's an honest tension that exists there, and how to balance those two tensions is a constant challenge, especially when people on either side try to demonize the other. And I do think it happens on both sides. It happens with Richard Dawkins on one side demonizing religion, and it happens on the religious side when people demonize science. And the trouble is, how can these two areas of authority get along? I guess in a way, that's what I was dealing with Washington and Franklin. How could these two lions of authority get along together? Well, it was partly their personalities that allowed it. And we had the same situation. How can the authority of science and the authority of religion get along together without clashing? And we have examples of great success, whether it be the Manhattan Project or the development of the COVID vaccine. And we also have areas where they just run head into each other in a culture clash that shakes us to our foundation.
Well, Ed, what are you working on now? I know a couple of years ago you wrote a book about, I know you're really fascinated with Antarctica and the exploration, the scientific explorations. What projects are on your plate now? I know you're teaching both history and law, so I imagine you have a pretty full schedule.
Well, it's a great question. I'm always working on a bunch of different things. I try to keep various projects going. I've always had an interest in scientific exploration, hence the work on Antarctica or the Galapagos Islands and the other areas. And I am doing more work in that area. I don't know what will lead to the next book. And I'm also working in the Revolutionary era to try to fill up more gaps, as I did with Franklin. I had the three books in the Revolutionary era: A Magnificent Catastrophe about the 1800 election between Jefferson and Adams, about the return of George Washington, about Washington's so-called fallow years between being a general and president, and then the Franklin and Washington relationship. And that I'm trying to develop some of those work. So actually I'm working in both areas, and I have research trips. If we can ever get over this COVID and I can get my second vaccination, I have research trips planned following both, another fellowship at Mount Vernon of Washington's Mount Vernon, and a trip going up to research things in the high Arctic. So I just don't yet know which is going to get through the writing first. I try to keep both going to avoid getting bored.
Well, how do you like to relax? Are you a sports person, or how do you unwind?
I love to hike. I love to garden. So I garden and I hike. I also like to swim. I like to swim in lakes or oceans, and so I'll get down and hike on the beach or go swimming in the ocean. And I also like to travel. That's why I'm hoping you'll have me out to Southern Illinois sometime, because I'd like to get back to Southern Illinois. There's some wonderful places to visit in our country. And as soon as we get this COVID done, I have several of them lined up. So I would say travel, hiking, and gardening are probably my favorite.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And we could obviously talk another couple hours. There's so many different areas to explore. But one thing I am going to follow up is to bring you down in Southern Illinois. I know you have also a special interest in Buckminster Fuller, who you had an occasion to meet. Tell that story if you could for a second.
When I was at University of Michigan as an undergrad, I spent 1 year of my college at University of Michigan, or was it a year and a half? And he was teaching there then. for some reason, and he was sort of co-teaching a course. I should say that that's a fairer description of a course I took it was in futures or some sort of futurology sort of thing. And I'll tell you, you talk about a mesmerizing sort of guru-like figure. I'm delighted you have his papers because he was a fascinating guy, and I had the good fortune. They had a geodesic dome or half of one at the South Pole when I was there. It's now taken down, and I went to the Montreal World's Fair, International Exposition in Montreal, where the United States had built a geodesic dome. So I had those also encounters with this fascinating person's thinking. In a way, he was a little bit like a Ben Franklin. He was a Renaissance man, a universal man, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you have there.
Okay. Well, Ed, we will definitely stay in touch, and we when circumstances allow, and also we have the Shawnee National Forest here, which would make for some amazing hiking. My wife and I have partaken of the trails. Would love to take you out and see some of the forest. So let's keep in touch, and thank you so much for your time and generosity.
Well, thank you so much. And again, Paul Simon was a truly extraordinary public servant, and it's an honor to do anything connected with him.
Thank you so much. We will use that in our commercial, Ed. Thank you. Appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for following another one of our series, Understanding Our New World. We will have a video of this up in the next day or two, so please look at it and send it to your friends and send out the word about Ed and his great books. Have them buy them and read them. Thank you for following us on social media and working with us to keep the legacy of Paul Simon alive and well. Thanks so much.